I was hanging paper snowflakes in the front window of our apartment when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. My son, Eli, was standing on a chair beside me, tongue peeking out in concentration as he pressed a crooked gold star onto the glass. He was 9, all elbows and hope, and he turned to me with that serious little face and asked if Grandma would like the gingerbread cookies we were bringing on Christmas Eve. I told him yes, of course she would. Then I looked down at my phone and read the message twice before it made sense. The whole family is invited for Christmas dinner at the house, but it would be better if you and Eli skipped the photos this year. I want one nice Christmas album without reminders of bad choices. A minute later, as if cruelty needed footnotes, another text came. You know how people talk, Hannah. A single mother and a fatherless child in every picture changes the tone. I didn't answer. I set the phone face down on the counter and told Eli the star looked perfect. 3 days later, standing in my mother's living room with half the family frozen silent around us, she would try to explain herself, and for once in her life, she would find that no one was helping her anymore. I'm Ava Mercer, 33, a school librarian, a single mother, and apparently the stain on my mother's Christmas card. If you've ever been treated like the embarrassing branch on your own family tree, then you know this kind of pain doesn't arrive loud. It arrives neatly, in perfect punctuation, in a message sent while you're icing cookies with your son. My mother, Judith, had always cared more about how things looked than how they felt. The tree had to be tall, the silver had to be polished, the family had to appear grateful, stable, impressive. Love, in her world, was something you earned by making her life look orderly from the outside. I stopped trying to earn it a long time ago, but Eli still believed in grandmothers. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and reread the messages. It wasn't just that she didn't want us in the photos. It was the phrase, reminders of bad choices. She meant me, my divorce, the fact that Eli's father had walked out when he was 3 and never bothered to walk back in. My mother had never forgiven me for being left, as if abandonment were a stain I'd chosen to wear. The next morning, Eli asked if Grandma had texted back about the cookies. I tied his scarf before school and told him Christmas plans were still changing. He looked up at me. Are we still family if we're not in the pictures? Children ask questions with surgical precision. They don't circle the wound. They put their finger right on it. I crouched in the hallway and zipped his coat all the way to his chin. Yes, I said, pictures don't decide family. People do. He nodded, but I could tell he was storing the answer away to test it later. My brother Caleb called that afternoon from his office parking lot, voice low and uncomfortable. Mom didn't mean it the way it sounded. She said Eli would ruin the photos. Long silence. She's under stress. People always say that when a cruel person is finally too tired to hide what they really think. Did you say anything? I asked. He hesitated just long enough to answer. No. That told me everything I needed to know. I would have skipped Christmas altogether if it had only been about me. But the thing about having a child is that your pride becomes less important than their memory. Eli loved Christmas at my mother's house. The huge tree, the train set around the fireplace, the way all the cousins slept in a pile of blankets after too much pie. I could survive one more holiday of being looked at like a cautionary tale if it meant he got one more year of magic. So I texted my mother back exactly one line. We'll come after the photos, she replied with a thumbs up. That should have been the end of it. A humiliation swallowed for the sake of peace. But family stories have a way of dragging old truths into the light when you least expect it. 2 days before Christmas, my Aunt Marianne called. She was my father's older sister, the only person in the family who still spoke to me like I was something other than a disappointment in sensible shoes. Hannah, she said, has your mother mentioned the house to you? I frowned. What about it? Another pause. Nothing, maybe. I just overheard Judith telling Caleb she'd already promised him the place, once she died. She said it only made sense to keep it with the stable branch of the family. Stable branch. I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still. My parents' house was the house my father built. He'd died 6 years ago, and if there was one thing he loved, with a near-religious tenderness, it was fairness. He was the sort of man who labeled tool drawers and wrapped birthday gifts in newspaper comics because he knew which strips made us laugh. He had once told me, after my divorce, a hard season doesn't make you worth less. So no, I didn't believe for a second. He would have wanted his grandson treated like an embarrassment to be cropped out of family history. That Christmas Eve, I drove Eli to my mother's house in a snowstorm so soft it barely seemed real. He wore the red sweater my friend Nora had knitted him and carried the gingerbread tin in both hands like an offering. The family photos were already done by the time we arrived. I knew that because I could see the tripod still standing by the tree through the front window. My mother opened the door in a burgundy dress and pearls. She looked at Eli first, smiled for him, and then looked at me with the expression people reserve for rain on an outdoor wedding day. "There you are," she said. "We've just sat down." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and ham glaze and old money. Caleb was by the fireplace with his wife. My younger cousins were on the floor with wrapping paper swords. My mother had arranged everything exactly as she liked it, and on the mantel, already framed in silver, was the family photo taken an hour earlier. Everyone was in it. Everyone. Except me and Eli. My son saw it before I could steer him away. He stood in the middle of the room, staring at that photograph of his entire family posed under the tree, all smiling in matching plaid, with a space where he should have been and never was. "Mom," he said quietly, "they already did Christmas without us." The room changed then, not loudly, just enough. Conversations thinned. Silverware slowed. My mother stepped in too quickly, voice bright and false. "Oh sweetheart, that was just the formal picture. We can still take casual ones later." Eli looked at her. "Why didn't you want me in the real one?" There are moments when truth walks into a room and sits down at the head of the table. This was one of them. My mother opened her mouth, but Caleb beat her to it, because Mom said the picture should look simpler this year. Simpler. His wife closed her eyes. My aunt set down her wine glass. My mother turned to Caleb with such naked fury that for 1 second she forgot to perform. "That is not what I said." "Yes, it is," he said, and now he sounded tired rather than scared. "You said Hannah and Eli make the family look messy. You said Christmas cards should show the life we're proud of." Nobody moved. I stood there with my hand on Eli's shoulder, and I realized something almost funny. I hadn't exposed her. I hadn't planned a speech. I hadn't even brought up the texts. She had built this moment herself, one cruel sentence at a time. And now the room was simply seeing her in the light she'd chosen. Aunt Marianne spoke next. "Judith, your grandson is standing right there." My mother's face went pale under the makeup. "I never meant." "Then what did you mean?" I asked. My voice was calm. That was the part that always unsettled her. Anger, she knew how to fight. Calm made her sound unreasonable even to herself. She looked at Eli, then at the framed photograph on the mantel, and something in her expression cracked. Not enough for redemption, just enough for shame. "I wanted one perfect Christmas," she whispered, and there it was. The whole religion of my childhood in one sentence. Perfect over kind, pretty over true, appearances over people. Eli tugged on my sleeve. "Can we go home?" I bent and picked up the gingerbread tin from where he'd set it by the door. "Yes, baby." As we turned to leave, my aunt called after me. "Hannah, wait." She walked to the mantel, lifted the silver frame, and carried it straight to my mother. "If that's your perfect family," she said, placing it into Judith's shaking hands, "you can keep it." Then she took her coat from the hall tree and came with us. So did Caleb. Not everyone. Families don't heal in one dramatic sweep, but enough. That night, my tiny apartment held more warmth than my mother's grand dining room ever had. Eli and my aunt decorated the extra cookies with too much icing. Caleb sat at my kitchen table and cried harder than I'd seen him cry since Dad's funeral. Around midnight, while snow pressed soft against the windows, he handed me a manila envelope he'd taken from his car. "Dad gave me a copy years ago," he said. "I should have shown you sooner." Inside was my father's will. He had left the house not to my mother, not to Caleb, but in equal trust for me, my brother, and our children one day. There was a letter clipped to it in his handwriting. No one gets erased just because life turned out harder than expected. Not while I'm still speaking. I read it twice, with tears blurring the words. My mother called 3 times that night. I didn't answer. Some consequences arrive all at once. Others arrive slowly, like winter settling into the walls. My mother eventually apologized, though not in the clean way stories like to pretend people do. It was messy, defensive at first, then smaller, then real, months later, when she realized Eli had stopped asking about her. The house was sold 2 years after that, exactly as my father wanted, and the money was split fairly. My mother hated losing control of the story more than she hated losing the property, but that Christmas taught me something I wish I'd learned sooner. People who are obsessed with perfect pictures will always ask you to step out of the frame before they ask themselves why love keeps leaving it. My son and I took our own photo that night. Just the two of us, flower on his cheek, frosting on my sleeve, my aunt laughing in the background. It's blurry. The lighting is terrible. The tree is too small. It is without question the truest family picture I have. I was standing beside my father's casket when my sister leaned close enough for only family to hear, and said, "Try not to make today about you for once, Nora. You've already been enough of a burden." She said it while I was holding my 6-year-old son's hand so tightly his little fingers went stiff inside mine. She said it in front of the lilies and the church candles and the polished oak box holding the only person in that room who had ever loved me without conditions. And then she smiled for the mourners as if she had said something kind. I didn't answer her. 3 weeks later, standing in the living room of the house my father built with his own hands, my sister would reach for the deed folder like it still belonged to her. And for the first time in her life, there would be nowhere left for her to hide when the truth finally stood up in the room. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 32, a widow, a mother, and according to my older sister, the family burden. If you've ever had a relative turn your hardest years into your permanent identity, then you already know this kind of story doesn't begin with the betrayal. It begins years earlier, in all the small moments when someone decides your pain is the most useful thing about you. My father's funeral was on a wet Thursday in November, the kind of gray day that makes every black coat look heavier. My son Owen wore the little navy blazer Dad had bought him last Easter, and every time someone bent down to tell him how sorry they were, he nodded with a solemn politeness that made me want to break in half. My father, Henry Whitfield, had died of a stroke at 6. Quick, the doctors said, as if there was mercy in speed. He'd been the sort of man who fixed your porch steps before you knew they were loose, the sort who kept spare batteries, cash in envelopes, and your favorite soup in the freezer in case life turned sharp without warning. After my husband died in a highway pileup 4 years ago, Dad was the one who showed up every Sunday to mow the lawn and pretend he was only in the neighborhood. My sister Lila liked to say, Dad spoiled me because he felt sorry for me. That wasn't true. Dad didn't pity me. He simply loved me in a family that treated love like it had to be earned through performance. Leela had always been the performer, the polished one, the married one, the woman with the tasteful kitchen and the expensive condolences. She stood at the front of the church in a black wool dress greeting guests like a widow in a magazine ad. One hand on her husband's arm, the other dabbing at tears that never quite fell. By the time we got to the graveside, she had already started talking about practical matters. "We'll need to move quickly on the house," she said while dirt tapped softly onto my father's coffin. "I've got a realtor friend who can list it before Christmas." I turned and looked at her, thinking I had misheard. "Dad's been dead for 40 minutes. She gave me that thin smile she used when she wanted to sound reasonable and superior at the same time. "And the bills won't pause for your feelings, Nora." Then came the burden line. Soft, precise, cruel enough to sting, quiet enough to deny later. I might have swallowed even that if Owen hadn't looked up at me in the car afterward and asked, "Why does Aunt Lila talk to you like you're in trouble?" Children hear truth before adults are ready to say it out loud. I drove us home through the rain and told him some people confuse being loud with being right. He nodded, but he kept staring out the window, and I knew the sentence hadn't done enough. 2 days after the funeral, Lila let herself into Dad's house with a key I didn't know she still had and started boxing things before I got there. My father's house sat at the edge of Maple Hollow on a 1/4 acre of stubborn land he'd never once considered selling. White siding, green shutters, a workshop out back that still smelled like cedar and motor oil. It was the house where every birthday cake had been cut, every report card inspected, every heartbreak quietly survived at the kitchen table. My father had built the back deck the summer I turned 10 and carved our initials into the underside of the railing where Mom wouldn't notice. By the time I arrived, Leela had already stripped the study shelves bare. "Those were Dad's records," I said. "They're papers," she answered. "We're clearing clutter." Her husband, Brent, was hauling framed photos to the garage like he was helping with a yard sale. I looked around the room and felt grief turn into something colder. "Did you ask me before touching any of this?" Lila laughed under her breath. "Nora, please. You can barely keep up with your own life. Someone has to handle this." That was always her angle. She didn't insult directly if she could help it. She dressed contempt up as competence. I wish I could tell you I marched across the room and put her in her place. I didn't. Grief makes strange cowards of us. So does family. I spent that afternoon wrapping Dad's coffee mug in newspaper while my sister made lists of what could be sold, donated, discarded. Every object in that house seemed to have 2 values now. The one my father gave it by loving it, and the one Leela gave it by pricing it. 3 days later, the first real crack appeared. It came through my Aunt June, my mother's sister, who called while I was making Owen macaroni and cheese. Aunt June had the kind of voice that always sounded like she was about to tell you who was secretly drinking or who had borrowed money they couldn't repay. "Nora," she said, "did Henry really leave the house to Lila?" I stopped stirring. "What?" She hesitated. "Lila told everyone after the burial that your father made his wishes clear, that the house was hers because she'd done the most for him, and because you already had enough help." I felt the wooden spoon go slick in my hand. Dad had never said any such thing to me. In fact, 2 months before he died, while we were replacing the batteries in Owen's toy train, he had looked around that kitchen and said, "No one gets to erase you from this house, honey. Promise me you'll remember that." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. I understood later, he had been talking about Leela. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I dropped Owen at school, parked beside a dented blue pickup, and walked into that beige municipal building with my stomach knotted so hard I thought I might be sick. I asked for the deed records for 17 Maple Hollow Road and sat at a metal table while the clerk printed the file. The deed was still in my father's name. No transfer. No probate filing. No sale paperwork. Nothing. Which meant my sister had not inherited the house. She was simply acting as if she had, counting on everyone's exhaustion to keep them from checking. That should have comforted me. Instead, it scared me, because people don't move that fast unless they're afraid time will expose them. I called the attorney whose name I found in Dad's old address book. A quiet estate lawyer named Martin Kessler who had drafted Dad's will 10 years earlier. He agreed to see me that afternoon. His office sat above a florist shop downtown, and when I told him why I was there, his whole face changed. "Your sister has been calling me for a week," he said carefully, demanding copies of documents I told her I could not release without both beneficiaries present. "Both?" He opened a folder, adjusted his glasses, and slid a paper across the desk. "My father's will left the house equally to me and Lila, but that wasn't the part that made my hands shake." Attached to the will was an amendment signed 8 months earlier after my father's second hospitalization. If either daughter tried to force the sale of the home within 1 year of his death, or attempted to deprive the other of her share through coercion or misrepresentation, that daughter's interest would be forfeited and placed in trust for Owen until he turned 25. I read it twice. Then I read the handwritten note clipped behind it. "Nora, if you're seeing this, it means Leela has started performing efficiency again. Slow her down. The house is not a prize, it's shelter. And I know which one of my girls understands the difference." My father had known. Not in some dramatic, movie script way. In the weary, loving way parents know the shape of their children's damage. He knew Lila loved control more than fairness. He knew I would hesitate to defend myself if it meant making a scene. So he had written protection into the only language my sister respected. Paper. I left Martin's office with a certified copy of the will and a nausea that felt almost like relief. The confrontation happened the following Sunday in Dad's living room. Lila had invited a realtor over without telling me. Brent was measuring the dining room. There were brochures on the coffee table and a yellow legal pad full of numbers in my sister's tidy handwriting. She looked up when I walked in, saw the folder in my hand, and I watched confidence flicker across her face before settling back into place. "You could have called," she said. "I wanted an audience." Aunt June was there. So was my cousin Melanie, who had stopped by with casseroles and stayed when she saw the measuring tape. Even Brent straightened a little, sensing weather. I set the folder on the coffee table. "Dad didn't leave you the house," I said. "He left it to both of us." Lila folded her arms. "I know that, and I'm handling it because you can't." "No," I said, and my voice was so calm it surprised even me. "You're handling it because you thought nobody would check." She laughed. "Nora, please." I opened the folder and slid the amendment across to her. "Keep reading." She did. I watched the color leave her face, one line at a time. Brent stepped closer. "What is that?" "It's Dad's addendum," I said. "The one that says if either of us tries to force a sale or use manipulation to deprive the other of her share within a year of his death, that person forfeits the house entirely. Their half goes into trust for Owen." Silence landed hard in the room. Lila looked up, and for the first time since the funeral, she looked less polished than frightened. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "He wouldn't do that." "He did," Martin Kessler said from the doorway. I had asked him to come. He stepped inside with his coat still buttoned, briefcase in hand. And suddenly my sister's house of cards confidence collapsed under the weight of a man with credentials and paper. He explained the clause. He explained that her repeated attempts to gain access to the documents, her false statements to relatives, and her efforts to list the property without my consent, had already created a very ugly record. If I chose to pursue enforcement, the court would likely side with the amendment. Lila turned to me then, not crying, not apologizing, just furious that the room had shifted and taken her balance with it. You would really do this to your own sister. The thing about bullies is that they always call it cruelty. When you finally stop volunteering to bleed. I looked around the living room, at Dad's old armchair, at the dent in the baseboard from the year I learned to roller skate indoors. At the house my son still called Grandpa's place. No, I said quietly. Dad did this because he knew exactly what you'd do if he didn't. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. In the end, I didn't take the whole house from her. I could have, legally, maybe even morally, but revenge and restoration are not the same thing. And I had a child watching how I carried both grief and power, so we settled. Lila signed an agreement, giving up any right to force a sale for 3 years. The house stayed in shared trust, with me managing it and Owen protected exactly as Dad intended. Brent stopped making eye contact with me after that. Aunt June told every relative who would listen that Henry had reached up from the grave and slapped sense into that girl, which was not elegant but wasn't entirely wrong. As for Lila, she never apologized for calling me a burden. Some people would rather choke on pride than spit out remorse, but she did stop saying it. And Owen, who notices more than I wish he had to, asked me one night while we were planting winter pansies by Dad's porch, "Did Grandpa know Aunt Leela was mean to you?" I pressed dirt around the roots and thought about that note in my father's handwriting, about shelter, about being seen. "Yes," I said, "I think he did." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded and said, "Good. I'm glad he picked us anyway." Picked us anyway. That's the thing I've learned about families who make one person carry the label of burden. They count your losses as if losses are character flaws. They confuse needing help with being weak. They call you heavy because it's easier than admitting they never intended to lift anything my sister stole. Dad's house before the flowers on his grave had even started to wilt. She called me the family burden at his funeral, and expected the old version of me to lower her eyes and step aside. But grief has a way of clarifying. The math my father didn't leave me a speech. He left me a safeguard, a line in the sand, proof, in black ink, that he knew the difference between a daughter who needed time and a daughter who needed control. And in the end, that difference was enough to keep the house standing. Leela wanted the property. What Dad protected was the home. The message came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was helping my 7-year-old daughter glue silver stars onto place cards for a wedding we were no longer invited to. I had written Maya in looping gold ink on one of them before I remembered there was no reason to finish. No reason to make neat little cards for a family that had already decided my child and I didn't belong in their celebration. My fiancé's mother, Denise, had called an hour earlier with the kind of voice people use when they want to say something cruel and still feel elegant while doing it. "I think it's best if you don't come to the wedding, Claire," she'd said. And of course, Maya shouldn't be there either. We need to think about the image of the day. Ethan deserves a fresh start, not a reminder that he's marrying a used single mom. Used. She said it softly, like she was choosing a tablecloth color. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked at the place card in my hand and watched the gold pen bleed a little too much ink into the paper. Maya was humming to herself beside me, legs swinging under the kitchen chair, completely unaware that someone had just tried to turn her mother into a stain. 3 weeks later, Denise would be standing in my apartment with tears ruining her mascara, asking me to save the wedding she had worked a year to control. And for the first time since I met that family, I would understand how quickly people panic when the woman they dismissed is suddenly the only one holding the truth together. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34, a pediatric physical therapist, a single mother, and, according to my future mother-in-law, a woman whose past made her unfit for a white dress and family photos. I met Ethan Parker 2 years after my divorce. Maya was for then, still sleeping with one sock on and one sock off. Still asking whether all dads moved to different states when they stopped loving the house. Ethan was patient with her in a way that made my chest hurt the first time I saw it. He learned how to braid doll hair badly. He showed up for preschool recitals. He never once treated my daughter like a complication he was generously tolerating. I loved him for that before I loved him for anything else. His parents did not share his enthusiasm. Denise and Richard Parker lived in a lakefront house full of beige furniture and inherited confidence. They were the kind of people who spoke about good families as if decency came with a zip code and matching holiday pajamas. From the beginning, Denise had a way of introducing me that sounded polite until you heard what was missing. "This is Claire," she'd say at dinner parties. "She has a little girl from before." From before. As if Maya were an old parking ticket instead of a child with a laugh bright enough to soften whole rooms. At first, Ethan defended me. He corrected his mother. He insisted Maya was part of the package, not a footnote. But families have gravity. If you stand too close to them for too long, even good people start leaning in old directions. By the time we got engaged, Denise had become almost theatrically helpful with the wedding. She paid for the flowers. She booked the ballroom. She offered her opinions on everything from my shoes to the seating chart to whether Maya should be flower girl. Every kindness came with strings so fine they were almost invisible. Then, 2 months before the ceremony, Ethan's ex-girlfriend showed up at his office. Her name was Brooke. She was polished, unmarried, childless, and exactly the kind of woman Denise had always wanted standing beside her son in wedding photos. Brooke claimed she needed legal advice for a business contract. Ethan, who was a corporate attorney and believed in being decent to everyone, gave her an hour. Denise found out and treated it like fate had left a calling card. After that, the comments sharpened. Brooke always understood Ethan's world. Brooke never came with complications. Brooke and Ethan were such a beautiful match. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But humiliation has a way of collecting in the body. It settles in your shoulders while you're folding laundry. It follows you into grocery stores. It sits beside you at night when the house is quiet and asks whether you're foolish for thinking you could ever be chosen cleanly. The day Denise called to ban me from the wedding, Ethan was in Chicago for a deposition. I texted him immediately. "Your mother just told me I'm no longer welcome at our wedding because I'm a used single mom. She said Maya is banned too." He called within seconds. "What?" he said, voice breaking with disbelief. "Claire, I swear to God, I didn't know." I believed him. That was part of the tragedy. "Did you know she's been meeting Brooke for lunch?" I asked. Silence. Then, carefully, Mom mentioned Brooke reached out a few times. "Ethan, it wasn't like that." I sat down at the kitchen table because suddenly my knees didn't feel trustworthy. Maya had gone to her room to color, and I could hear her singing to herself through the wall. I thought about the word used. I thought about my daughter being treated like visual clutter at her own future stepfather's wedding. "Your mother just uninvited your fiancé and her child from the wedding," I said. "If it's not like that, then tell me exactly what it is." He exhaled hard. "I'll fix it." That's what people say when they still think the problem is a misunderstanding and not a character reveal. He flew home the next morning. We sat in my apartment after Maya went to bed. And for the first time since I'd known him, Ethan looked young, rather than capable, stripped down. Ashamed. She admitted she said it. He told me. She said she was trying to protect me from making a mistake. "And what did you say?" "That she crossed a line." I waited. He looked at the floor. I also told her the wedding was off until she apologized. Off. Not postponed. Not discussed. Off. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired in a way sleep couldn't touch. "What about you?" I asked quietly. "Do you still want to marry me if it means your family will never stop punishing us for it?" He lifted his head then, eyes red-rimmed. "I want to marry you because you and Maya are the only part of my life that feels honest." It was a beautiful sentence. It just wasn't enough yet, so I asked for time. 3 days later, the second disaster arrived. My friend Naomi worked at the boutique hotel where Denise had booked a private rehearsal dinner for the wedding weekend. She called me during my lunch break, voice low and urgent. "Claire, I don't know if this is my business," she said, "but your future mother-in-law was here this morning with a woman named Brooke. They were asking whether the ballroom date could still be used if the bride changed." I went cold from scalp to heel. "What?" "I'm sorry. I thought you should know. There is a particular kind of heartbreak, reserved for the moment you realize your humiliation wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, considered, organized, like centerpieces and catering deposits. That evening, I asked Ethan to meet me at the apartment without telling him why. I put my phone on the kitchen table between us and played Naomi's voicemail. He listened once, then again. By the second replay, his face had gone completely still. "She wouldn't," he said. "She already did." He stood up so fast his chair scraped the hardwood. "I'm going there." I didn't stop him. Later he told me what happened in his parents' dining room, though I could picture most of it without help. Denise had denied everything until he mentioned the hotel employee by name. Then the story changed. Brooke had only been there for support. The ballroom questions were hypothetical. Richard, who had spent months saying nothing while his wife sharpened herself against me, finally admitted he'd known Denise was trying to push Ethan back toward Brooke for his own good. For his own good, that phrase does a lot of damage in families that mistake control for love. Ethan walked out. He withdrew every wedding payment that came from his own accounts. He called the florist, the band, the photographer, the venue. He canceled the legal contract on the ballroom extension his parents had signed in his name. And because Denise had insisted on managing everything through a maze of favors and deposits and status arrangements, the whole wedding machine started collapsing before sunset. By the end of the week, she was in trouble. Not emotional trouble, financial trouble. The ballroom deposit was non-refundable unless the event was rescheduled under the same couple's contract. The florist had already imported winter peonies she couldn't return. The photographer's cancellation fee was brutal. Denise had fronted extra upgrades, assuming Ethan would reimburse her after the wedding gifts came in. Instead, she was staring at a 5-figure mess and a son who had stopped answering her calls. That's when she came to my apartment. I opened the door to find Denise on my doormat in a cream coat, mascara smudged, hands trembling around her purse. For one absurd second, I thought someone had died. "Claire," she said, "please, we need to talk." Maya was in the living room, building a blanket fort. I sent her to my bedroom with an iPad and a bowl of grapes, then stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me. Denise's eyes darted toward the apartment like she was checking whether my child might hear her desperation. "Ethan won't speak to us," she said. "He's canceled everything. If you tell him you forgive me, he'll calm down. He'll listen to you." I stared at her. 3 weeks earlier, this woman had called me used like I was a car with too many miles and not a human being, who had survived things she could never understand. She had tried to replace me with a more convenient bride before I was even fully gone. And now she was asking me to save the wedding she had burned down herself. "Why would I do that?" I asked. Her mouth tightened, then softened. "Because you love him." There it was. Not remorse. Strategy. I folded my arms against the December cold seeping through the hallway window. "Do you know what Maya asked me after your phone call?" Denise said nothing. She asked if being from before meant she didn't get to be in family pictures anymore. Something changed in her face then. Not enough, but something. "I never meant to hurt the child," she whispered. "People always say the child, as if distance makes cruelty smaller." "You didn't just hurt her," I said. "You taught her that love in your family comes with a purity test. That if someone has a past, or a scar, or a father who left, they become something embarrassing to crop out." Tears slipped down her cheeks. Real ones this time. I think, but tears are not the same thing as accountability. Sometimes they're just grief over consequences finally becoming visible. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. I thought about Ethan, about how broken he'd looked at my kitchen table, about Maya practicing how to spell Parker in looping crayons because she wanted our last names to match after the wedding, about all the ways women like Denise confuse getting their way with getting their family back. "I want you to tell the truth," I said. "To Ethan, to Richard, to anyone you've painted me for. I want you to say exactly what you did and exactly why. No edits. No soft language. No misunderstanding. And after that, I want you to understand that forgiveness is not the same thing as access." She blinked at me, stunned. "I'll do it," she said quickly. "Anything." A week later, Ethan agreed to meet his parents at our church with me present. Denise cried. Richard looked like a man who had just discovered silence can also be a form of betrayal. And for once, no one protected her from her own words. She admitted she'd tried to replace me with Brooke because she couldn't stand the idea of her son marrying a divorced mother. She admitted she'd used Maya as leverage because children are the easiest pressure point in any woman's life. She admitted she thought if she pushed hard enough, Ethan would drift back toward the version of his life that made better pictures. Ethan didn't say much after that. He just took my hand and left with me. We did get married, eventually. Not 3 weeks later. Not in the ballroom Denise chose. 6 months later, in a small botanical garden with 30 people, folding chairs, and Maya scattering petals down the aisle like she was blessing the ground. Denise was invited, but only after months of real apology and very firm boundaries. She sat in the back row. She did not make a speech. She did not choose the flowers. She did not touch the guest list. Some people would call that a soft ending for a revenge story. I don't. Because the revenge was never about humiliating her back. It was about forcing the truth into the room and refusing to disappear so someone else could feel respectable. It was about watching a woman who thought I was disposable realize that the son she raised would rather lose a wedding than lose us. Sometimes that's enough. Maya is 10 now. She still has the place card with her name in gold ink, though she keeps it tucked inside a jewelry box instead of on a table. Once, not long ago, she asked me why I saved it. I told her it reminds me of something important. What? She asked. That anyone who makes you feel like leftover parts should never be allowed to plan your future. She laughed at that, because she's old enough now to hear the steel under the sentence. Then she slipped her hand into mine and said, "Good thing you didn't let them throw us away." No, I didn't, and neither did Ethan. The voicemail came while I was standing in the cereal aisle comparing store-brand prices with my daughter's asthma prescription pulled up on my phone. My mother's voice was clipped, almost cheerful. The way people sound when they've already decided they're right and are simply informing you of the damage. Just so there's no confusion, Emma, I've signed the house over to Daniel. It's done. He has a family to think about, and frankly, you don't deserve to keep claiming a place in this one after everything. Stop by this Sunday if you want the rest of your things from the attic. Then she hung up, no pause, no explanation, just the sound of a woman sealing a door and assuming I would stand politely on the other side of it. My daughter Lily was beside me in the cart seat, swinging one sneaker, and trying to talk me into the cereal with the cartoon astronaut on the box. She was 8 and all soft seriousness. The kind of child who still said thank you to vending machines if they gave her 2 snacks by mistake. I smiled at her, put the cheaper cereal in the cart, and tried to breathe around the sentence still ringing in my ears. You don't deserve family. 3 weeks later, my brother would be standing in the front hallway of that same house with his face gone white, my mother shaking so hard she could barely hold the envelope in her hand. And for the first time in my life, the story they'd built about Mitha, unstable daughter, the needy one, the woman who should be grateful for scraps would collapse under the weight of paper, memory, and one truth my father had been careful enough to leave behind. My name is Emma Lawson. I'm 34, a nurse, a divorced mother, and according to my mother, the daughter who somehow failed the family exam by surviving badly. If you've ever been the one your family only mentions in lowered voices, then you know this kind of betrayal doesn't begin with property. It begins with labeling. One bad year becomes your personality. One broken marriage becomes your moral record. One season of asking for help gets turned into proof that you were never built right in the first place. My brother, Daniel, had always been the son my mother could present without editing. Married at 29, to clean children with expensive names, a wife who hosted Easter brunches with cloth napkins and called my mother Mom in a voice that made me tired. Daniel worked in commercial real estate, wore watches that looked heavy, and had perfected the art of sounding concerned while saying cruel things. Emma just has a lot going on, he'd say at family dinners when I was sitting right there as if I were a weather pattern. The house my mother had given him was the one my father built when I was 6. White shutters, blue hydrangeas along the walkway, a swing on the old maple tree where Dad used to push me so high I'd swear I could see over the whole neighborhood. It was the house where my first grade height was penciled into the pantry door frame and never painted over. The house where my father sat on the edge of my bed the night my husband left and told me that a person walking away from you was not proof you were hard to love. Dad had been gone for 11 months. A heart attack in his workshop. Quick, everyone said, as if speed made grief more polite. After he died, my mother changed in a way that looked like grief from far away but felt more like permission up close. She started talking about fairness as if it were a luxury the strong couldn't afford. She sold Dad's truck without asking, gave away his tools, turned his study into a guest room before the flowers from the funeral were fully dead. It was like she was trying to erase the evidence that anyone had ever loved that house for reasons other than its resale value. I should tell you something ugly and true. When my marriage fell apart 3 years earlier, I moved back into that house with Lily for 6 months. I was 31 working double shifts at St. Vincent's, trying to hold together a child with wheezing lungs and a bank account that seemed offended by my existence. My ex-husband, Grant, had discovered that fidelity was apparently optional if you traveled enough for work. He left with one suitcase and the kind of apology that sounded rehearsed. I spent those first months after the divorce moving through life like someone carrying water in their hands, trying not to lose more than I already had. My father took us in without 1 ounce of pity. My mother never forgave me for needing it. She never said it directly. Not then, but she counted everything: the electricity, the groceries, the extra laundry. Every time Lily had a coughing fit in the night and Dad drove us to urgent care, my mother would sigh in the morning like our fear had interrupted her sleep on purpose. Daniel and his wife, Melissa, would stop by on Sundays with pie and judgment. looking around my childhood bedroom now crowded with Lily's inhaler spacers and my nursing textbooks, and I could feel them filing away the image. Emma came home. Emma failed. Emma needed. That's the thing about some families. They don't just witness your hardest season, they preserve it like evidence. The Sunday my mother told me to come collect my things, I drove to the house with Lily in the backseat and a knot in my stomach that felt older than I was. She'd asked if Grandma was mad at us again. I told her adults were complicated. It was the nicest lie I had. My mother opened the door wearing lipstick, too bright for noon, and an expression so cold it almost impressed me. Daniel was already there, standing in the living room with a folder tucked under his arm. Melissa sat on the sofa, pretending not to enjoy herself. "I'm just here for the attic boxes," I said. My mother stepped aside. "Good. Let's keep this civilized." Civilized? As if I'd arrived with a crowbar. I went upstairs to the attic and found my life stacked in banker's boxes, photo albums, my old debate trophies, Dad's handwritten notes from the year he coached my middle school science fair project. Someone, my mother, I assumed had labeled one box Emma's leftovers in thick black marker. I stood there for a moment with dust in the sunlight and that word in my face, leftovers. When I came back downstairs, Daniel was waiting by the dining room table with the folder open. Mom thought it would be cleaner if we handled the transfer now while everyone's present. I stared at him. "Handled what?" "The deed," he said, too casually. "I'm refinancing. And the attorney suggested you sign an acknowledgement that you understand the house is no longer part of Dad's estate." My mother folded her arms. "It belongs to Daniel now. There's no reason to drag this out. There are sentences that don't land all at once. They keep unfolding after they're spoken. Like a knife opening." "You gave him Dad's house," I said. "I gave it to the child who understands what family means," my mother snapped. "Not the one who treated this place like a shelter and then disappeared the minute life got difficult." I actually laughed then, just once, because the cruelty was so naked it stopped pretending to be concern. "Disappeared," I said. "I moved 20 minutes away to keep working and raise my daughter." "You used your father," she said, voice rising. "You came crawling back with a child and a divorce and expected us to rescue you. Daniel built a life. You just keep recovering from one mess after another. At some point, Emma, you don't deserve family just because you were born into it." Lily was in the hallway behind me. I knew it before I turned because children always appear at the exact moment adults fail them most completely. "Mom," she whispered. I spun around. She was clutching the stuffed rabbit she took everywhere when she felt scared, her face small and stunned. "Grandma doesn't want us in the family." The room went very still. My mother looked at Lily and, for one flicker of a second, seemed to realize what she had done. Not enough to undo it, just enough to make the silence uglier. I got Lily into the car before I let myself cry. She sat in the passenger seat of my old Honda with tears drying on her cheeks and asked the question I knew was coming. Did Grandpa want us there? I gripped the steering wheel and thought of my father teaching Lily to plant tomatoes in the backyard. Both of them covered in dirt and taking it very seriously. "Yes," I said, "more than anything." That night, after Lily fell asleep on the couch with her nebulizer humming softly beside her, I opened the attic boxes in my apartment living room looking for distraction and found something else. Entirely it was tucked inside, one of Dad's old ledger books from the hardware store he used to own before retirement. A cream envelope with my name in his handwriting. Inside was a note and a business card for an estate attorney named Harold Pike. "Emma, if your mother starts rewriting the story after I'm gone, call Harold before you sign anything. There are things she doesn't know I changed." My father had underlined "don't know" twice. I stared at the note until the words blurred. The next morning, I called Harold. He remembered me immediately. "Your father expected I might hear from you," he said. That sentence alone was enough to make my throat close by. Wednesday, I was sitting in his office above a bakery downtown while he laid out the truth. My mother had been trying to bury underperformance and paperwork. My father had placed the house in a family trust 6 months before he died. Not to my mother, not to Daniel. The property was to remain unsold for 5 years, available for use by any direct family member who needed housing, with equal long-term ownership split between Daniel and me after that period. There was one additional clause. If any beneficiary attempted to pressure, deceive, or coerce another family member into surrendering their interest in the property, that person's share would be suspended pending court review and reassigned if misconduct was proven. My father knew us too well. He was worried. Harold said gently, sliding a copy of the trust toward me. "Not about you," About what grief and money might turn your family into. I thought of the black marker on that attic box, Emma's leftovers. Then I thought of my father, sitting at his workshop desk late at night, writing protections into legal language because he knew I was too tired to fight loud people without help. The confrontation happened the following Sunday. Harold came with me. My mother was hosting brunch for Daniel and Melissa when we arrived. There were cinnamon rolls on the table and fresh flowers in the kitchen. The whole scene arranged like a magazine spread about healthy family bonds. Daniel saw the lawyer first and went pale before a single word was spoken. My mother set down the coffee pot with a clatter. "What is this?" Harold introduced himself and placed the trust documents on the table between the orange juice and the fruit salad. "This," he said, "is the instrument governing ownership of the property your late husband transferred last year. Mrs. Lawson, you did not have the authority to gift this house to your son." Daniel reached for the papers. His hands were shaking by the second page. My mother looked from him to me, then back to Harold. "That's impossible. Robert told me." "No," I said quietly, "he didn't. He knew exactly what you'd do if he didn't put it in writing." She sat down hard in one of the dining chairs. Harold continued in that calm, merciless lawyer voice. "Daniel's attempt to secure my acknowledgement under false pretenses could be interpreted as coercive interference with a trust beneficiary. If pursued, it could trigger the misconduct clause. In plain English, the house he'd been celebrating as his might become legally untouchable to him for a very long time." Melissa made a small sound in the back of her throat. Daniel looked like someone had removed the floor from under him. My mother turned to me then, and what I saw on her face wasn't remorse. It was fear. Fear that the story had slipped out of her hands. "You'd do this to your brother?" she asked. "It's strange how often the people who wound you call boundaries cruelty." "No," I said. "You did this when you told my daughter she didn't belong in her grandfather's home." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Lily had stayed with my neighbor that morning, and I was grateful for it. She didn't need to watch adults discover that paper can speak louder than favoritism. In the end, I didn't take the house from Daniel, even though legally I might have been able to push for it. I did something my mother never expected from the daughter she called weak. I made terms. Daniel signed a formal acknowledgement of the trust, and a written apology for trying to pressure me. My mother was barred from making any further property decisions. The house stayed exactly as Dad intended, protected, unsold. Available if Lily or I ever needed it. Available if Daniel's family did too. Shelter, not a trophy. My mother didn't speak to me for almost 2 months after that. When she finally did, it was not to apologize. It was to ask whether Lily wanted the old swing from the maple tree repaired for spring. People like my mother don't know how to say I was cruel. They only know how to offer gestures and hope you'll translate them into forgiveness. I let Lily decide. She said yes. Sometimes I think that was the real revenge. Not the lawyer. Not the trust. Not watching Daniel's face drain of color at the brunch table. It was refusing to become what they called me. Refusing to be desperate enough for belonging that I'd let them rewrite what family meant in front of my child. My mother gave my childhood home to my brother and said I didn't deserve family. What she forgot was that my father had built more than a house. He built a way back in. The laugh came from the kitchen. Not loud. Not the kind that fills a room. It was softer than that, almost careless, which somehow made it worse. My daughter had asked a simple question in the doorway with her little pink cardigan still buttoned wrong, and my sister, Vanessa, had laughed like the answer was obvious, because Grandma wanted a proper family party. "Sweetheart," she said, reaching for the fruit platter like she hadn't just split the room in half. "These things are complicated." My daughter, Sophie, was 7 years old. She still believed adults only laughed when something was funny. So she stood there in my mother's kitchen, clutching the handmade birthday card she'd spent 2 days decorating with glitter glue, and tried to smile like maybe she had misunderstood. I didn't say anything. Not then. 3 weeks later, my sister would be standing in the middle of my mother's dining room with her lipstick gone pale and her husband staring at the floor, while every guest at that proper family party finally learned exactly why. Vanessa had been so desperate to keep me and my daughter away from it. My name is Rachel Monroe. I'm 35, a physical therapist, a divorced mother, and, according to my sister, the kind of family member who should learn to stop showing up where she isn't wanted. If you've ever been the sibling people rewrite in real time, then you know these stories don't begin with one cruel sentence. They begin with years of careful editing. One sister becomes accomplished, stable, elegant. The other becomes difficult, fragile, too much. It doesn't matter how many bills you pay, how hard you work, How many nights you stay up with a feverish child and still make it to your shift the next morning. In some families, your role gets assigned early, and everyone gets very comfortable when you keep playing it. Vanessa was 2 years older than me, and had spent most of our lives being the kind of woman strangers described as polished before they knew anything else about her. She married well, dressed well, hosted well. She knew how to turn every room into an audience and every conversation into a performance where she always got the best lines. My mother adored that about her. My mother, Elaine, believed deeply in appearances, matching napkins, smiling photos, the kind of family that looked expensive even when no one was saying anything kind. I was the one who left my marriage at 31 with a 6-month-old baby and a suitcase full of onesies because my husband had decided vows were apparently flexible if temptation wore perfume, and worked in marketing. My mother called the divorce messy. Vanessa called it predictable. Neither of them had been the one standing in a dark nursery trying to rock a screaming infant while their whole life cracked open one dishonest text message at a time. Sophie and I moved into a 2-bedroom rental across town and built something quieter, smaller, truer. My mother never forgave me for choosing survival over optics, so when she planned her 65th birthday brunch and sent invitations to everyone in the family except me, I can't say I was shocked. Hurt? Yes, but not shocked. The invitation oversight, as Vanessa called it later, was exactly the sort of cruelty my family liked best. Plot deniable and perfectly timed. What surprised me was Sophie finding out. We had stopped by my mother's house the Thursday before the party because Sophie wanted to drop off the birthday card she'd made. It had tiny pressed flowers glued around the edges and the words "Happy Birthday, Grandma. Love, Sophie" written in her careful second-grade handwriting. My mother wasn't home yet, but Vanessa was in the kitchen arranging catering trays because of course she was. She had taken over the party from the moment she realized it could be used as another family portrait where I was cropped out. Sophie saw the balloons first, then the stack of place cards on the counter. "Is Grandma having a party?" she asked. Vanessa smiled without looking up. On Sunday, Sophie waited a beat. "Why aren't we coming?" That's when Vanessa laughed, because Grandma wanted a proper family party. I don't remember crossing the kitchen. I just remember kneeling beside my daughter and taking the birthday card from her shaking hands because suddenly I was afraid she'd drop it. Sophie looked at me with those wide brown eyes children get when they're trying to understand whether the world has changed in the last 5 seconds. "Mom." I stood up slowly. "We're leaving." Vanessa finally glanced at me, expression already rearranging itself into innocence. "Oh, Rachel, don't be dramatic. I just meant it's a small guest list. There are 60 place cards on your counter." She shrugged. Mom didn't think it would be comfortable. Comfortable. That word. So clean. So dishonest for who? I asked. Vanessa set down the knife she'd been using to slice strawberries and folded her arms. "For everyone." Sophie asks a lot of questions about why her father isn't around. Mom didn't want the mood turning sad. And honestly, after the divorce, people still talk. You know how these things are. No, I knew how Vanessa was. I got Sophie into the car before I let myself react. She sat buckled in the back seat, with tears slipping silently down her face, still trying to hold on to dignity the way children do when adults humiliate them in public. "Did Grandma say she doesn't want me?" she whispered. "There are questions you can answer with facts. And then there are questions that only let you choose between honesty and mercy." I was still deciding which one my daughter needed when she asked the second question. "Is Dad not here because I'm not proper either?" I had to pull the car over. I turned around in the driver's seat and unbuckled enough to reach for her hand. "No," I said, with more force than I intended. "Listen to me. None of this is because of you. Adults can be small and mean and embarrassed by things that don't deserve shame. That is their failure, not yours." She nodded because she's always been the kind of child who wants to help, even while she's hurting. Then she asked if Grandma would still get the card. "Yes," I said. But I didn't send it. That night, I put the card in my kitchen drawer and called the one person in my family who had never confused silence with peace. My Aunt Linda, my father's sister. She listened without interrupting while I told her what happened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Rachel," she said carefully, "has Vanessa been handling your mother's finances lately?" I frowned. "Why?" Another pause. "Because your mother called me last week asking whether I remembered the password to your father's old brokerage account." She sounded confused, and Vanessa got very strange when I asked why she needed it. My father had been dead for 5 years. He was an accountant who believed in clean records, sharpened pencils, and fairness so stubborn it sometimes bordered on a religion. If he had left anything unresolved financially, I would have known. He used to joke that spreadsheets were the only form of prayer he trusted. Mom's never mentioned any account to me. I said. She may not know enough to. Aunt Linda replied. I'm not trying to stir trouble, honey, but if Vanessa is excluding you this aggressively, I'd ask myself what she doesn't want you around to notice. That sentence stayed with me all night. The next morning, while Sophie was at school, I drove to my mother's house under the excuse of dropping off a casserole and found her sitting alone at the breakfast table with a legal pad and a pair of reading glasses she wasn't wearing. The house smelled like lemon polish and fresh flowers. Party prep was everywhere. Linen samples, seating charts, wrapped silverware. My mother looked tired in a way makeup couldn't fix. Rachel, she said, surprised. I thought Vanessa told you Sunday was crowded. She did. I set the casserole on the counter and sat across from her. Mom, why did you really leave Sophie and me off the guest list? She blinked at me, then looked down at the legal pad. I didn't, she said softly. I stared at her. What? I made a rough list, she said. Vanessa said she'd handle the invitations because my arthritis was acting up. I assumed everyone got one. The room seemed to tilt a little. My mother had many faults, but lying cleanly had never been one of them. She was vain, yes, image-conscious absolutely, but this confusion on her face wasn't performance. It was something more fragile. And suddenly the balloons, the place cards, the laughter in the kitchen all rearranged themselves into a different picture. Mom, I said carefully, why did you need the password to Dad's brokerage account? Her hand froze on the legal pad. How do you know about that? Aunt Linda mentioned it. My mother looked toward the hallway as if Vanessa might appear there by saying her name too loudly. I've been trying to sort out some things. There are withdrawals I don't remember authorizing. Vanessa said they were for party deposits and the condo taxes, but the numbers don't add up anymore. I felt something cold settle into place. Can I see? She hesitated, then pushed a folder toward me. I spent 8 years working in rehab medicine, not finance, but grief teaches women how to read paperwork fast when they have to. The statements were from the trust my father had set up for my mother's retirement steady. Conservative, untouched for years. Until 6 months ago. Since then there had been a series of transfers to a consulting firm I'd never heard of and one large withdrawal for a property reserve. The authorization signatures looked like my mother's name written by someone who had only seen it from across a room. Who is Stonebridge Family Consulting? I asked. My mother's mouth tightened. Vanessa said it was an estate management service. I already knew it wasn't. That afternoon, after a very short conversation with a lawyer friend from work and a longer one with Aunt Linda, I had enough to understand the shape of the lie. Stonebridge Family Consulting wasn't a real management service. It was an LLC registered 6 months earlier by Vanessa's husband, Mark. The property reserve transfer had gone toward the down payment on a lake cabin. They'd recently told everyone Mark's bonus had covered, and suddenly the party made perfect sense. Vanessa wasn't just keeping me away because I was the embarrassing divorced daughter with a fatherless child. She was keeping me away because I'm the one person in the family who still looks at documents before I trust explanations. She knew if I spent any real time with Mom, the numbers might come up. She knew my father had taught me enough about money to get suspicious when things smelled wrong. And she knew Sophie's question in that kitchen had come dangerously close to blowing open a story Vanessa was still trying to control. The brunch was on Sunday at 1. I arrived at 1:15 in the blue dress Sophie liked because she said it made me look like the moms in the good ending of movies. Sophie wore white tights and the pink cardigan from Thursday, buttoned correctly this time. She carried the birthday card in both hands. The dining room was full. Cousins, neighbors, my mother's church friends, Vanessa's in. There was a giant floral arrangement in the center of the table and a framed sign by the cake that read "Celebrating Elaine" in gold script. Vanessa was near the mimosa bar, laughing with 2 women from her Pilates class when she saw me. The smile fell off her face so quickly it was almost satisfying. "What are you doing here?" she hissed as I walked in. "Attending Grandma's party," Sophie said before I could answer. A few heads turned. My mother rose from her chair, relief washing across her face when she saw us. "Rachel." "Sophie. I'm so glad," Vanessa cut her off. "Mom, we talked about the guest list." "No," I said, loud enough now that the room began to quiet. "You talked, the rest of us were just supposed to obey." Mark appeared at Vanessa's shoulder. already wearing that strained expression men get when they know their wives have built a fire and they may soon be asked to stand in it. I took the folder from my bag and set it on the dining table beside the cake. I thought maybe after brunch, Vanessa said through clenched teeth. No, I replied. I think now is better, since you're so concerned with proper family events. The room went still in the particular way rooms do when rich people realize they might be about to witness something impolite. I opened the folder and turned to my mother first. Mom, did you authorize these transfers to Stonebridge Family Consulting? Her face strained as she looked at the pages. I don't think so. Vanessa stepped forward. Rachel, stop. This is not the time. Funny, I said. You seemed very committed to timing when you told my daughter she wasn't proper enough for this room. A murmur moved through the guests. Vanessa glanced at Sophie, then away. I kept going. Stonebridge Family Consulting isn't an estate service. It's on LLC registered to Mark. The money came out of Dad's retirement trust. The same trust you told Mom not to worry about because you were handling everything. Mark's face had gone gray. Vanessa opened her mouth, but for once the performance was outrun by facts. It was a loan, she snapped. We were going to pay it back. With forged signatures. I asked. That did it. My mother sank into her chair as if her bones had been removed. Aunt Linda, who had arrived 10 minutes earlier and was now standing near the china cabinet like an avenging librarian, took the papers from my hand and started reading dates aloud. Transfer amounts, account numbers, the down payment on the cabin, the consulting invoices with no services attached. Vanessa tried to talk over her, then over me, then over Mark, who had made the mistake of whispering, I told you this would come out eventually. The whole room heard that. My mother looked at Vanessa with a kind of horror I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not embarrassment. Betrayal, stripped of makeup. You stole from me, she whispered. Vanessa's eyes filled immediately. Mom, no, I was trying to protect things by excluding my daughter and granddaughter from my birthday so Rachel wouldn't notice. My mother's voice cracked. By making a child feel unwanted in her own family. Nobody rescued Vanessa then. Not her husband, not the guests, not even the women from Pilates, who suddenly found their quiche extremely interesting. Sophie, who had been standing quietly beside me this whole time, walked to my mother and held out the birthday card with both hands. Happy birthday, Grandma, she said softly. My mother took it like it weighed 100 pounds. 3 weeks earlier, Vanessa laughed when my daughter asked why we weren't invited to Grandma's party. By the end of that brunch, Vanessa and Mark had been asked to leave. The trust was locked down the next morning. Lawyers got involved. The cabin was sold within 2 months to repay most of what they'd taken. My mother, who had spent years pretending Vanessa's sharp edges were just confidence in heels, finally had to sit with the fact that she had handed power to the wrong daughter because the wrong daughter looked easier to display. As for Sophie, she still asks hard questions. Children who've been embarrassed by adults tend to become very honest people. A week after the party, she asked me if Grandma still counted as family now that she'd let Vanessa be mean to us. I told her family isn't a title people get to keep automatically. It's a way of treating each other. Some people have to learn that late. My mother apologized. Not once, many times. The first few were clumsy and full of tears and excuses. The later ones were better, quieter. She started coming to Sophie's school concerts. She learned how to braid hair badly. She stopped talking about keeping the peace and started using the more difficult words. I was wrong. I don't know if that erases anything. I don't think family works like an Etch-a-Sketch. But I do know this. People who care more about a perfect party than the people missing from it are usually hiding something uglier than bad manners. Vanessa wanted a proper family event. What she got was the truth, served right after cake. The first time my sister called me a lowly single mom, she did it over brunch. While our father was still alive and pretending not to hear, she said it lightly, the way cruel people often do when they want room to deny it later. Well, not all of us had the luxury of building our whole identity around being a lowly single mom. Ava, then she sipped her coffee. My aunt laughed into her napkin. My brother stared at his eggs. And my father, my kind, exhausted, conflict-avoiding father just looked down at his plate and said nothing at all. I wish I could tell you that was the moment I stood up, threw my water in her face, and walked out forever. I didn't, because my son was 6 then and needed his inhaler refilled that week. Because I was working double shifts at the hospital and barely keeping my head above rent. Because when you've spent enough years being treated like the family disappointment, humiliation stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like weather. You don't fight every storm. Sometimes you just try to get home dry 3 months after my father died, my family would sit in a lawyer's office and tell me, with matching expressions of pity and contempt, that Dad had cut me out of his will because he was tired of supporting bad choices. 40 minutes later, my brother would be unable to look me in the eye, my aunt would be crying into a paper tissue, and my stepmother's perfectly folded hands would start shaking so hard she had to sit on them, because my father had, in fact, left me out of the will. He had just also left behind something else. My name is Ava Mercer. I'm 33, a registered nurse, a divorced mother, and according to most of my family, the cautionary tale they liked to keep around so everyone else could feel successful by comparison. If you've ever been the one your family speaks about in lowered voices, then you already know how these stories begin, not with one dramatic betrayal, with repetition, with labels, with years of having your hardest season turned into your permanent identity. I married at 24 because I thought love meant endurance. I left at 29 because I finally learned it didn't. My ex-husband, Darren, had a gift for apologies that sounded sincere until you noticed he only used them after he'd already done what he wanted. By the time I found the messages, the hotel receipts, and the credit card charge for a necklace that definitely wasn't mine, I was 7 months pregnant and too tired to even cry properly. My son Eli was born 6 weeks later with a shock of dark hair and lungs that made everyone nervous for the first year of his life. He wheezed in cold weather, coughed through spring pollen, needed breathing treatments at 2 a.m. on nights I had to clock in at 7. I moved into a small apartment, worked nights, and learned how to function on broken sleep and caffeine. I didn't ask my family for much, not because they weren't capable of helping, but because they had a way of making help feel like evidence. My older sister Marissa was the worst of it. Marissa had the house with the stone entryway, and the husband, who sold commercial insurance, and the 2 daughters who looked like catalog children in matching Christmas dresses. She believed deeply in personal responsibility, especially when it applied to other people. Every time I showed up to a family dinner after a long shift, hair still smelling faintly of antiseptic and baby shampoo, she'd find a way to say something with a smile attached. Some of us plan better than others. Maybe if you stopped rescuing every stray problem, you'd stop living like one. And of course, lowly single mom, my father, Thomas Mercer, rarely defended me in the moment. That was the wound inside the love. He adored me quietly and disappointed me publicly by saying nothing when silence was easiest. But he showed up in other ways. He paid for Eli's first specialist visit when my insurance dragged its feet. He changed the brakes on my car one November because he happened to notice they were bad. He kept a spare pack of diapers in his truck long after Eli had outgrown them, just in case. My stepmother, Judith, liked to say Dad babied me because he felt guilty. She never explained for what. Dad died in late February of a stroke that arrived fast and left nothing behind but paperwork, casseroles, and the kind of silence that settles into a house after the person who held it together is suddenly gone. He was 6. I still had a voicemail from him asking if Eli wanted to come plant tomatoes that weekend. The funeral was cold and crowded and full of people who spoke in softened voices about how generous he'd been. Marissa cried beautifully. Judith accepted condolences, like a queen receiving tribute. My younger brother, Colin, stood beside the casket looking hollowed out. I stood near the back with Eli in a tiny black sweater vest and felt like I was watching my own life through glass. 2 weeks later, Judith called to say the will would be read the following Monday. Her tone was formal enough to make my stomach tighten. When I got to the attorney's office, everyone was already there. Judith in cream wool, Marissa in navy, Colin in a suit that still had department store creases in the sleeves. My Aunt Denise, Dad's older sister, had somehow inserted herself into the proceedings even though no one had asked her to. She gave me a look that was half sympathy, half appetite. The attorney, Mr. Bell, was a quiet man with silver glasses and the kind of expression people in his profession probably practice in mirrors, serious enough to command a room, neutral enough to survive family warfare. He began reading. Judith received the lake cottage and the majority of Dad's retirement accounts. Colin got Dad's truck and a cash inheritance. Marissa got a substantial investment account and the antique dining set she'd been hinting about for years. Then Mr. Bell paused. As for my daughter, Ava Mercer, he read, I make no direct bequest under this will. The room went still in that ugly, electric way silence gets when everyone is trying not to look too pleased. I didn't feel shock at first, just heat, rising from my chest to my face in one clean wave. Judith touched my arm like she was comforting a stranger. Ava, your father loved you. He just worried that money in your hands would disappear the way other opportunities have. Marissa sighed softly, the performance of compassion already underway. Dad spent years helping you, Ava. Maybe this was his way of making sure the rest of us were considered, too, the rest of us, as if I'd been a weather emergency. They'd all heroically survived. I stood up so quickly, my chair scraped the floor. He told me he was updating the will last fall. He did, Judith said, and this is the result. Mr. Bell cleared his throat. There is an additional document. Every head turned. He opened a second folder from beneath the first, one I hadn't noticed before. The paper inside was heavier, cream-colored, with my father's signature at the bottom, and a date from 6 months earlier, right after his second minor stroke. The one Judith had told everyone was just dehydration. This is a notarized letter of instruction, Mr. Bell said, to be opened only if Ava Mercer receives no direct inheritance under the primary will. No one moved. Mr. Bell began to read. If this letter is being opened, then it means one of two things. Either I changed my mind in a way my daughter deserves, explained, or someone changed it for me after I was no longer in a condition to fight back. My breath caught, so sharply it hurt. The room had gone silent in a new way now, not smug. Afraid. I am writing this because I know my household. I know how quickly grief turns into administration, and administration turns into control. I know who mistakes Ava's difficult years for evidence of weak character, and I know who has been counting my assets before. I'm even in the ground. Judith's hand slid off my arm. Mr. Bell adjusted his glasses and kept going. Ava, if you are hearing this, I need you to listen carefully. In November, after my hospitalization, I signed a temporary revision to my will under pressure from Judith and Marissa, who argued that you had already taken enough from me, and that any inheritance left to you would be wasted on rent, childcare, and bad decisions. I was medicated, exhausted, and ashamed to discover how little strength I had left for a fight. I signed because I intended to undo it when I recovered. Aunt Denise made a strangled noise. I turned slowly toward Judith. Her face had gone the color of old paper. Mr. Bell's voice remained steady. I did recover enough to understand what had happened. I also recovered enough to make arrangements they did not know about. He set down the letter and reached for a third document. This, he said, is the trust instrument Mr. Mercer established 3 weeks after the will revision. The trust held a duplex property on Willow Street paid off, recently renovated, and valued at more than everything Marissa had just inherited. My father had bought it quietly through an LLC years earlier after selling part of his business. One unit was already rented. The other, the larger one, had been left for Eli and me to live in rent-free for as long as needed. The rental income from the first unit would cover taxes, maintenance, and create an education fund for Eli. If I ever chose to sell, the proceeds were to be split between me and my son. I sat back down because my legs had stopped feeling reliable. Judith stared at Mr. Bell. That can't be right. It is, he said. The trust is valid, funded, and entirely separate from the will. Marissa found her voice first. So he hid property from his own wife? No, Mr. Bell said, still maddeningly calm. He protected it from people he believed might misuse their access to him. Then he lifted the letter again. One more thing, he read. If Judith or Marissa attempts to challenge this trust, interfere with Ava's occupancy, or misrepresent my intentions to my grandson, the enclosed evidence package is to be released to all named family members and, if necessary, to the probate court. Mr. Bell looked up. The evidence package includes copies of text messages, financial transfers, and a recorded conversation Mr. Mercer made after he became concerned about coercion. I don't think I breathed for the next 5 seconds. Colin stared at Marissa like he'd never seen her before. Aunt Denise was openly crying now, though whether from guilt, shock, or disappointment that the drama had turned on the wrong people, I couldn't say. Judith leaned forward. Thomas was confused. He had strokes. He also recorded you, Mr. Bell said, quite clearly. That ended it, not because Judith suddenly became honest. People like her don't collapse into confession. They pivot, they minimize, they search for new wording that makes the old cruelty sound administrative. But the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Colin stood up and walked to the window, one hand over his mouth. Marissa kept blinking like if she did it enough, she might wake up inside a different ending. I asked to hear the recording. Mr. Bell hesitated, then pressed play. My father's voice came through thin but unmistakable, tired, angry in a way I had almost never heard. Judith was telling him I'd bled the family dry long enough. Marissa said if he left me anything substantial, I'd just burned through it like every other lowly single mom who mistakes survival for virtue. Dad told them to get out of his room. Judith laughed. Marissa asked if he wanted Eli living off pity forever. Then the recording ended with my father saying, very clearly, "You don't get to punish my daughter for being abandoned by a bad man." I cried then. Not neatly, not elegantly. I cried the way grief makes adults cry when it drags old humiliation into the light and names it correctly for the first time. Afterward, I took Eli to see the duplex before I moved in. It was painted pale yellow with a crooked little mailbox and a backyard just big enough for a tomato garden. Eli ran through the empty living room shouting because children know the sound of hope before adults do. In the kitchen, taped inside one of the cabinets, was an envelope with my father's handwriting. For Ava and Eli. Inside was a short note. "You were never a burden. You were the bravest person in this family. I'm sorry it took me too long to say it where other people could hear." That sentence undid something in me I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Judith and Marissa did try, briefly, to challenge the trust. They backed down the moment Mr. Bell reminded them the evidence package would become part of the court record. Colin stopped speaking to Marissa for nearly a year. Aunt Denise sent me a card full of apologies and cash, as if guilt could be folded into an envelope and made useful. I took the money, then donated it to a shelter for single mothers. Because here's the thing I learned. My family called me a lowly single mom and cut me out of Dad's will. Assuming shame would finish what exclusion started, they thought survival made me smaller, easier to erase, easier to lecture, easier to punish. What they forgot was that my father had finally seen the difference between a daughter who needed help and the people who resented her for needing it. He left them the performance. He left me the truth.